Okay, this is going to be a quick, or at least as quick as I can make it, rundown of my After Effects script called zilch, which are these three buttons, and this is my K-bar version of that. And really, it is a iteration on void, no solids, and a little bit turbo layers. So I had been using turbo layers for a long time, which literally just gives you buttons to add solid layers, null layers, shape layers, text layers, cameras, lights, etc. And then Battle Axe came out with Void recently, and that has been kind of a big game changer for a lot of people. There's also No Solids by Element Supply Co., which do basically the same thing. So if you want to know why this is useful, you should definitely watch the Battle Axe video explaining why shape layers are better than nulls and solid layers. But for the rest of this video, I'm just going to take it for granted that you do think that that's useful. And all three of these scripts go about the same thing, and they have slightly different features, but none of them have all the features combined. And then there were a few extra features that I really wanted out of them to make them daily drivers for me. So I kind of started from ground zero, took bits and pieces from each one, and added a few of my own features to create my own set of tools. So before I get into this, just a quick note on the colors. I'm going to be using my custom color palette, which you can see indicated here. But just at the beginning, I want to say that it's really dumb that After Effects defaults nulls and solids to both be red. That just makes everything so confusing. So at the very least, default your nulls to be a different color than red. If you use something like motion, then it usually defaults them to green. So that's what I set it up for in my color palette. As an illustration, this is turbo layers. All it does is adds a null, adds a solid layer that defaults to black, or adds an adjustment layer here. For some reason in turbo layers, the adjustment layer does not take my default color. But those are the colors that I'm going to be working with as a point of reference. So let's start off with a quick comparison. Again, turbo layers just acts like you're using the After Effects commands to add a null object, add a solid, add an adjustment layer, etc. Void and no solids have a bit more features. So no solids will add this yellow shape and it will center the anchor point. Void will create this red shape and also center the anchor point. And that's generally more useful than the default null, which has the anchor point in the upper right corner. So for zilch, I went with a nice bright magenta, very similar to the void script, also centered. And then we have a couple of controls on each of these. So for both no solids and void, you scale up the width and the height individually. With void, you have some commands to offset the position without moving the anchor point. That's not something that I really use in my workflow, so I did not include that. But what I did include is it defaults to square. So if you just adjust the width, it will scale up the entire shape. And then you can link them and you can adjust the width and the height individually. But I often found myself trying to make one side bigger, make the other side bigger, so I just combined it all into one square control. And another thing that applies to all of the zilch controls, so the zilch controls are, zilch is your null control, zone is your solid layer, and zest is your adjustment layer. So this is me, again, kind of following in the footsteps of void, volume, and variant. I thought their alliteration was pretty fun, so I tried to go in that direction as well. But one thing that void and no solids don't do that turbo layers did do is turbo layers will automatically adjust to the duration of whatever layers are selected. So no solids does not do that, and void does do it for void layers, but not for volume or variant layers. And that was something that I really wanted because, especially for adjustment layers, I'm usually trying to add an adjustment to a select set of layers. And so it's really useful to have them be that size. And same thing with the solid layers. So moving on to the solids, which in Void is called volume, and it will prompt you for a color control right off the bat, defaults to a kind of middle gray, and it has no controls on it, but it will default to the size of your comp. No solids has this rectangle control that just puts a white rectangle, that's the size of your comp, and with the zilch controls, zone will create a black solid that fills the comp, and you have a couple of controls here. So you can adjust the color here, which can be easier than going through the fill. It just lets you see everything in the same place. And then by default, it's kind of pseudo locked. So you can't drag it around because it's always going to fill the comp unless you turn off this comp size lock. And then it will set itself to the position wherever it had been moved. But if we recenter it, then we can also adjust the width and the height. And we again have a square control. And then only the width will adjust the scale. And then we also have a roundness control, so we can bring it pretty quickly to be a circle. So that kind of combines several of the no solids into one control, because no solids will let you create an ellipse really quickly, and it lets you square off the rectangle. And it also gives you controls to create a shape with only a stroke and not a fill, and vice versa. Zone will only create the fill. It will actually never have a stroke, at least in this version. So you'd have to go in and add a stroke yourself. And then at any point, you can click the comp size button again, and it will fill it, although it will keep the roundness control. But you can always bring it back to the full comp size. That's useful for me because I often just need to quickly drop a zone or a solid layer right at the bottom of a composition that's going to be the background. And so without having to think about locking it, without having to think about anything, I just have a color at the background that's going to stay there throughout the composition. And then the zest is pretty simple. It's an adjustment layer, and again, it goes on top of multiple layers. It will be set to that duration, and then all it has is the full screen lock. So it will again be pseudo locked, and then you can turn that off, and then you can just scale it and adjust it as you would, or just drop it to be the full screen. So that's really the only controls for that one. Now sometimes I actually want to put the layer at the bottom of a layer stack instead of at the top. So right now, all of these will default to putting it right above the layer that's selected. And that's true for the zilch controls as well. But if you hold down Control, you can actually place the layer at the bottom of the layer stack, which is sometimes useful for things like if you have some kind of element and you want a background for that element, then you can hold down Control and you have a new background element just for the duration of this element, or however many are selected. So that bottom placement is true of both the zone and the zest controls, but not for the zilch control, because there's a few other things that the zilch control does. So when we take a look at some of the more advanced zilch controls, first of all, the zilch control will always find the average point of the selected layers and be placed there in the center. And that's also true of the void controls. And I'm just going to kind of create some variation here real quick so we can use these as examples. So if we hold down Control while we create our zilch layer, then we're actually parenting the transparency of all the selected layers to the zilch layer. So what that means is that we can set opacity controls and control them all at the same time. And that can be used in conjunction with another one of my scripts, which is fade layers. And so then that adds fade controls based on markers or the in and out point. So you can do some interesting stuff with that. So the other thing we can do is if we hold down Shift while we create the zilch layer, then we create one zilch per layer. And then there's another feature of zilch that I have found surprisingly useful. And it's a feature that you don't really think that you need until you realize that you do need it. Let's say we have some keyframes on a few of these layers. Then if we hold down Alt, the zilch layer will be created and it will actually transfer the transform properties to the zilch layer. So when we create this one, now when we look at our keyframes, the square is doing the exact same thing, but all those keyframes are being controlled by the zilch, which means that we can now move this, and we haven't changed where the source of that animation is coming from, but we can move the position. And you can also combine certain controls. So if we do Shift and Alt while clicking zilch, then we've transferred the controls of both of these layers. So then we've created one zilch per layer, and we've transferred those keyframes to each of the zilch layers. So really all of those controls can be combined. So if we do Control Shift Alt, then we create one zilch per layer, and we transfer the keyframes, and we have linked the opacity to each one's individual zilch layer. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. It kind of gets you out of some tight corners sometimes, and if you are a null addict like I am, it comes in really handy to be able to just throw nulls everywhere and add some extra controls and flexibility to them as you go. Hello and welcome to an appendix of sorts for this video. I'll explain why this video needs an appendix later on, but long story short, I recorded this video over 2 years ago, and so I wanted to make a couple of minor additions to the information in this video. One thing I noticed when I came to re-record this video before I realized that I had already recorded it in full, and so I just went with my original take, is that one difference between void and zilch is that zilch will maintain the parenting hierarchy of your selected layers. So you can see here I have these layers that all are parented to their individual zilches. If I select them all and I create a void, they will all be default parented to that one void. However, zilch will maintain the parenting hierarchy and just take the topmost parent and parent it to the new zilch. That, I feel like, is pretty important, and I'm not quite sure why zilch doesn't do that, but there you have it. The other thing is I wasn't sure at the time, but there is actually a feature for void to create one void per selected layer, which is Alt-Shift. So that is similar to zilch, and it does actually maintain parenting hierarchy when you do it per layer, just not when you have a bunch of layers at the same time. Still not sure why that is. The other thing to note is the first time I recorded this, I did not realize that by default, no solids null will position itself in the center and not be parented to anything, but if you hold down Shift, it will parent the selected layer to the no solids and act in the same way that void and zilch default to. No solids also has an option to create a controller, which just creates a blank layer. It doesn't even have a shape or anything in it. So I guess that's for putting effects that you reference with expressions. I'm not completely sure. Also, in more recent versions of void, you have create a blank void, which creates a void with no shape to it at all. I think that's to cut down on the graphics rendering. Void also has some other more advanced features, like adding voids to path points, which is super helpful. Again, I'm not a pro coder. I just really wanted a couple of key features that I laid out earlier in this video. If you're still watching and you care at all why I am releasing this video 2 years after I recorded it, I think originally I got a little overwhelmed by the feature comparison, and I also wanted to like create a spreadsheet that showed all the different features and stuff like that, but I just didn't know if anyone would care, and I had just posted this series of tutorials and hadn't really got any feedback on them. But in the last 2 years, I have received a lot of downloads of my scripts on Gumroad. Like, surprising, I get emails every couple of days saying that someone downloaded a script, which I really appreciate, and I guess told me that there is some kind of market for these tools out there, even as rudimentary as mine are. I mean, I'm not getting rich off of them, but considering each of those tutorials is pretty much under 2 minutes long, and I didn't expect anything to come from it, I've been pleasantly surprised. So I figured I might as well release it. And I also use the zilch controls like every day, constantly in my workflow. I like Void. Void does some things that I don't even know how to code. And again, it was the inspiration for this. But zilch has been my daily driver ever since I finished coding it. So I hope y'all can find a place for it in your workflow like I have. But I think that's enough for now. Thanks for watching.